Hi, friends, and welcome to Illuminate, a storytelling podcast about queer spirituality. This is season 2 of Illuminate, and after a wonderful 4-episode run for season 1 earlier this year, it's exciting to get back together with people from Christ Church and from beyond to talk about stories that celebrate and center queerness and spirituality, showing that these two things are opposites or things that we need to marry, but are already somehow intrinsically intertwined. For those who don't know me, my name is Reverend Tyler Heston. I serve here at Christ Church as our Minister of Spiritual Formation and LGBTQIA plus development. And with our LGBTQIA plus ministry, it's a gift to offer this podcast to you, the world, our listeners, wherever you may be. And I am thrilled to have one of our own from Christ Church joining me today, Debra Davis. Debra, would you take a minute to introduce yourself and tell us how you're coming to this podcast today?
Absolutely. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. So, Tyler, my name is Debra Davis. I have been with Christ Church now for 11 years, roughly, something like that. You know, my background professionally, I come from an IT consulting background, but germane to this conversation, I am the proud parent of a trans child, Emerson. So you'll hear me use they, them pronouns, but you also might hear me say he, him, because those are also on the table too.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, thank you, Debra. For those who are watching Illuminate and may have seen our Illuminate service this past June, Emerson was one of our speakers during that. And if you missed it, fam, you can go on to the church's YouTube and maybe I'll link it in this video later, but you can watch that. It was a wonderful service from top to bottom, but especially Emerson's testimony. And Debra, I think you did a testimony at one of those Pride services a couple years ago, even before my time. So
yeah, I did. That was 2 years ago that I did that one, and that was a lot of fun. It was a tremendous what's sort of looking for honor. It was definitely an honor. I felt very honored to be able to get up there and share as someone who is, you know, I identify as cisgendered heterosexual, and my child would be transgendered. And I don't know what the other part is yet, and it's okay. I don't need to know what that other part is yet. We'll just let that be. That being said, to be able to get up and, you know, share my thoughts of what it means to be a parent and to have build a wonderful relationship with my kid, you know, I was really excited. I'll talk about it anytime, as you can see, because I'm here on this podcast.
Well, it's an honor to have you as part of this podcast today. As we were just talking before we started recording, and as we've been talking through each episode of this podcast, like, I believe that queerness is good news for everybody, which means to find out more about what this queerness is. We can't just look at the people who fit neatly into certain identity designations, but must open the door wide. And I've been really looking forward to this conversation in particular to learn about what allyship has taught you and what it might teach others, and just how meaningful it is for me to talk with a parent who's as amazing of an ally and human being as you are. So let's probably get started. So Debra, I believe that you have a story ready for us, some story that centers or celebrates or illuminates this juxtaposition between queerness, what it is that happens with and around LGBTQ people and allies and spirituality. So why don't you go and share that story and we'll launch on into conversation from there.
Absolutely. Well, you know, I was very honored that you reached out and asked me to talk with you on this podcast. And at first I was kind of like, wow, I don't know if I have a story or how I'm going to do this, because to give you a little background, I know that everyone's experience is very different around identity, around sexuality, and in my experience, especially with my kid, there was never a coming out of the closet aha moment. You know, there was never a mom, I'm this kind of moment. But I also will say it wasn't like my kid, I knew since my kid was 2 that this was going to, like, oh, wow, you know, this was something that just over time filtered in, and, you know, we made room for Emerson to just be who they are. And over time, we're like, oh, I see who you are. You're showing me who you are. And I get it. Like, I can fully see that. So I was really struggling to come up with a story, but, you know, it finally hit me. So we're gonna go round trip on this one. When I was in my 20s, I was at a different church in Chicago. I was at a Methodist church in Chicago. And I was asked to lead the middle school Sunday school for the year. And like a good consultant, I go in my first day of Sunday school And, this is 6th, 7th, 8th grade. And I get my whiteboard, got my big whiteboard there. And I said, okay, guys, I pull out my marker and I said, all right, I'm going to be your instructor for this school year. I'm going to make a list. Tell me everything you want to know. Like, give me topics. Let's brainstorm topics. And then we're going to pick out like the top 10. Don't hold back. And let me tell you, that was the dumbest thing I could have ever said to a room full of middle schoolers. Don't hold back.
Because as someone who said that in front of many a room of middle schoolers before, yes.
I mean, and they were convinced that they were going to trip me up, or because they were looking to see if I was really honest or not, or if I was going to pull a fast one like other grown-ups. We got into some real doozies, which I'll leave off. But one of my favorite ones, and this one, when I wrote it down on the board, I was like, oh, I'm in for it now. The question was, what does God look like? Right. And okay, I'm just going to put it on the board, right? Because in this session, it's not about answering the question. It's just about getting the questions, right? And that one was number one, the question that every kid wanted answered, right? I was like, okay. I don't have a background in theology. I don't have, but I committed to them. I said, I'm not going to tell you that I'll come up with the answer, but I will commit to you that we'll have a great conversation about all of these topics, right? So I go off and I had some that built into this, but then I get to this lesson and the kids thought I was going to wince out. They thought that there's no way that she's going to say, or she'll probably say, well, he's white, or he's this, or he's old, or maybe it's a girl, maybe it's and to make a long story short, in my layperson's way and all my research, I found, the overarching concept is we are all made in God's image. Right? We've all heard that before. We're all made in God's image, right? Sure. But if you really stop and think about that, and you stop and you look at the scripture supporting that concept, it really changes everything. Because as I said to the kids, we agreed in the census with the kids. I'm like, do you feel that God makes mistakes? Can God make a mistake? Everyone's like, no. I mean, what we do with it afterwards, that's free will, but no. So then I was like, well, what if God doesn't make mistakes? That means, and I kind of pointed to the kids, he's black, he's white, he's Hispanic, he's a she, he's a they, he's a him, because God is so immense and so huge that our brains can't comprehend all that he is. So we pull the slices and pieces that we can relate to. So if you think about it, God is a celebration of literally everyone, right? I am very proud that the entire classroom of middle schoolers just slack-jawed staring at me for a second. And then we really got into a great conversation. But, that really stuck with me for a long time. Now, that was in my 20s. I didn't have my kid until I got pregnant at 30. And that thought really stuck with me. And like I said before, I never saw my child as like, oh, my kid's gay, or my kid's straight, or my kid's this, or my kid's that. I was like, we are all celebrations of aspects of God. So whoever this child is, I will recognize them as that aspect that I am, what's the word, privileged, lucky enough to be able to spend time with and to nurture and to direct and grow and really do my best with. So that then, when we started getting into the middle school years and the conversation became around, well, when my kid just came to me and said, Mom, I don't want long hair, right? It starts like gender affirming care. Everyone thinks it's like something really crazy. My kid started with, Mom, I really don't like long hair. I want to wear short hair. Okay. Mom, all my polos for my school uniforms, I want to button them up to here. Okay, great. Mom, I don't really like wearing skirts. I like doing, okay, great. And so when I'm honoring Emerson as an aspect of God, it just helps me see all of that in a different perspective, so that I go, okay, I'm honoring who you are and making space for you. You don't have to do everything the way I do it. We're just like, let's be healthy, whole, and find our way together as we do it. Anyway, so as we've made these decisions and we've had these conversations, and now Emerson is 18 and off to freshman year of college, I continue to see that evolution and the development of Emerson, and I just respect it and say, okay, how is our relationship evolving? How are we? And if I take a sidestep for a second, when you stop and you apply that to everything, I think a lot of people have a hard time open, as you said it earlier, swing that door wide. Because when you swing that door wide, when you say we are all made in God's image, it's not just LGBTQIA, it's literally everyone. And that can be really daunting for a lot of people. That can be very scary to think, wow, well, what about someone that doesn't speak my language? Or what about this person or that person over there that I don't like, or that person that honked at me in traffic? It becomes a lot to process. So.
Ooh, I love that. I mean, like 5,000 thoughts, but maybe 2, 3.
Please.
We'll see. I mean, first you're affirming, because the confirmation class that I taught earlier this year, this was 2024, and like the similar programs I've taught before, I always begin talking about that idea of the image of God and finishing the first lesson with this: we are made in the image of God, which is to say, I look like God. So like the opening litany that all of these usually sixth graders, repeat every week in confirmation classes: I am made in the image of God. I look like God. God looks like me. Yeah. And I'm always like, is that too woo-woo to really be worth teaching? No, it's not. Apparently it's a fantastic theological concept.
Yeah, especially at that age, because, one of the things that I'm grappling with, or sort of thinking through right now, is this concept of other, right? Mm-hmm. When you designate someone as other, or you feel other, you're immediately disempowered. You immediately feel you're pushing uphill, right? It just brings in this whole host of issues. When you can talk to kids and help them celebrate who they are, and being part of the group doesn't mean everyone looks exactly the same. That was my high school that I grew up in, and let me tell you, that doesn't work. Like, it's just not a great. I didn't love that. When you can help kids and adults feel connected, valued, celebrated for their differences, not a blind eye turn to it of just saying like, oh, we don't, I grew up in the age when it was, oh, we don't really talk about color. We don't really talk about race. And that was fighting racism then, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well-intentioned, but we know now that sort of devalues people's experience. And we actually need to celebrate their experiences and acknowledge it. And if that means my kid comes to me and says, hey, Mom, I'm a they, them, and I go, wow, I would have lost points on an English paper years ago for using the wrong plural for a singular. You know what? If that's the hardest work I have to do, is just get over that, fine. My kids got it much harder, sort of balance, finding their way in the world. Yeah, I can find some they, them pronouns for you. You want to switch to he, him, you have my full support.
Hallelujah. There's like this mental image I'm seeing in my mind as you're sharing just what you were just saying, but even in the original story too. Like in a class recently, we were looking at Genesis 1, and there's like a Jewish website of, I guess, all trans voices. It was talking about how that story is loaded with positive and some negative, but mostly positive potential for like trans readings of Genesis 1, especially because there are some ancient and contemporary readings that read like there's two creation stories in Genesis 1 and 2. Like they're kind of different, but they kind of go together. That's a whole nother conversation. But sometimes you can read them to suggest that maybe the story was that God created like a non-gendered being originally, and then when Adam and Eve became Adam and Eve, or man and woman, because the Hebrew words for them were not necessarily names, but just dust and woman. Like that's when gender came into the equation. So there's this like, anyway, it's a bigger picture than what we often imagine. Anyway, what I'm seeing, like when we talk about image of God and the image of God, I'm seeing like a picture, right? Like, or a frame, I guess. And oftentimes we can, thinking about being an ally for queer people or being a queer person of faith, like we see the task maybe as making the frame bigger and saying like, well, the image of God isn't this small, it's this big. But I think what you're doing is showing us that there's no frame around the image of God to begin with. Because what you said from the get was realizing if we are all created in the image of God, then there is no boundary, there's so many theologies and philosophies of otherness. I was reading a book on otherness in the Gospel of John like 45 minutes ago. So I'm trying not to be too doctoral right now. But when we like take that theology seriously. There's no others within the image of God. There's no boundaries around
Right.
the image of God, which is such a different framework than constantly having to expand that image, like anti-crop it by
Right.
making it bigger, in which you have to, it still relies on like understanding things to be brought to the image of God. Well, like, I think certain people in your position or in others might say, like, well, I understand that the image of God is bigger than I realize it can be, but in order for me to understand how you fit into the image of God, I need to understand you first,
Right.
which would look like, oh, I don't get what it means to have a trans kid, but now I
Yeah.
understand how I can incorporate you. But then, oh, now I don't get that you're changing your pronouns, or oh, now I don't get about this sexual fluidity. Like, oh, now I have to bring the border even bigger. What if there's no border in the first place?
Yeah, the border, and that's a great way to put it. The frame of that picture only existed for the period of time it took for me to connect, right?
Mhm.
It's like a view into something that's much bigger and broader behind it. And when you really stop and think about it, you just can rip that frame off and say it's huge. That can be terrifying to some people. A lot of people love to think in binaries because it's fight, flight. It's this, it's that, it's here, it's there. I know, just give me my mark, like just make it simple for me. And I understand where someone might come to that because they see that there's me, there's them,
Mhm.
and that means if they get it, I don't have it, and it becomes a scarcity of resources issue
Mhm.
versus one of my favorite expressions that I saw at the Pride March, this was pride isn't like pie. It doesn't mean if you get a piece of pie, I don't get a piece of pie. It's like it's that's not how it works, right? It's not pie. It's the more that we support one another and the more secure we are and the more we celebrate God together in our own ways the better it gets for all of us, right? Because there's more joy, there's more connectedness,
Mhm.
right? Biggest scourge of mankind right now is, and you're starting to hear it all over the news, is loneliness.
Mhm.
People fighting loneliness and disconnection, right? It has
Mhm.
negative health outcomes, it shortens lifespans, and so at a time when we're all fighting to combat loneliness, how can we then wrap a frame around, this is exactly what God and Jesus look like. And if you don't look like this, or you don't agree that they look like this, then well, let me tell you where the loneliness starts to come from. You have to have a certain vulnerability to open up and say it is much bigger. And you know what? I don't have to understand it all. I'm not going to understand. I've said this to my kid. I'm like, I had a different experience growing up than you have. I'll back up in a second and say one thing. I've talked about this in all very, very positive ways up until now, but I'll be really honest and say there was a major thing that I had to deal with when the picture became very clear that my child's trans and they're in high school. You've got prom, right? Growing up in the Midwest, prom, like that's a thing. That's prom season, proposals and, dresses and the whole thing. And it kind of hit me like a punch to the chest of what I thought I was going to have raising a child one gender. I have to grieve that child because that child doesn't exist anymore.
Mhm.
But that child only existed in my head. It wasn't the child's responsibility. That's my responsibility to deal with. And so once I grieved that and said, that's not going to be my experience as a parent, it freed me up to then say, well, what experience am I going to have?
Yeah.
And the doors that have opened up, I mean, I knew nothing about, like when my kid came home and used the word cisgendered heterosexual, I went, huh, what? Like, okay, I know what heterosexual is, but walk me through that for a second. And
Uh-huh.
my doors and my eyes started opening so much that I was like, oh wow, this isn't how I grew up, but this is pretty cool.
Mhm.
All right, I get it. Let me support you on this.
Mhm.
But there is that process of, there's, I think so many parents get locked into, and so many parents get this concept of it was this way for me, so it should be this way for my child.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
sometimes you have to ask yourself, is that really true? God offers us so many experiences.
Well, I appreciate too how you named that there's still real grief in that. That's a lot of the theory that I like to work with talks about how queerness is, it's not an identity. It can't be summed up in a specific community or specific list of identities, but rather it's this disposition towards normativity. So the like
Yeah.
systems in our society and our culture that lift up certain things as normal and certain things as abnormal. Queerness is like opposed to that, first and foremost. Some people would say that queerness is not necessarily a good or bad thing. It's just an anti-normativity too, but we can argue with queer theorists later. All that to say, I think if queerness is about this rejecting of the norms to build something new, I mean, it's joyous, it's jubilee, it's beautiful. I see God in that, and there's still grief in that because you have to let go of something. But it fits exactly with what you were saying about abundance versus scarcity mentalities. Like, there's grief in giving up this comfortable life. There's only enough to go around, and there's joy on the other side. And making space for that process, I think, helps all of us get the picture a little bit more bigger. Like,
Yeah,
it's comfortable. I mean, like, I think some of the reasons we think scarcely, I think some of the reasons we grasp onto frameworks for who God is, and like the reasons fight or flight is an evolutionary mechanism that's helped humanity evolve into who we are. But as we continue to evolve, we can grow past those mechanisms, grow past those things, and realize, I think, the goodness that was all around us all along. We just didn't quite have that
absolutely.
to see and the ears to hear. So yeah, like,
Yeah. You know, you said one of the things that I've really gotten out of being an active ally, being a parent has made me move into a more active perspective, is that openness. So when you were talking about at the beginning, is spirituality and queerness, are they in diametric opposition or are they actually the same thing? You know, becoming an active ally, I really see them as intrinsically linked. That queerness has, for me, looking into queerness and understanding queerness as an ally, you can't be binary and, close-minded. It opens so many doors in all of the experiences that I've had and all the learning that I've been doing. I see so much celebration of so much diversity because there isn't one heteronormative social way to be. There's
mm,
so much more room for expression, which that just really reflects God's abundance to me. You know, that
mm,
the bounty and the abundance and the ways to live a life and who people are. And so I think where, I started years ago in understanding we're all made in God's image, but now to be living it with a queer child and with a wonderful queer community that has not gate kept allies out of the conversation at Christ Church, I just see that abundance flourish. And I think it's wonderful.
mhm. So, I mean, I knew you would already answer the questions to prompt discussion.
Well, I can paraphrase. So,
I mean, you gave a great answer right there for what does queerness mean to you. Like, do you have a succinct definition for what spirituality means to you? Maybe in line with what you just said.
wow, now you're really challenging me. You know, I think that many times people can conflate or confuse spirituality and going to church, or spirituality and calling themselves some type of Christian or Jew or some. And I think those two can sort of mess each other up. I think spirituality is being connected to a larger whole, being
Mm,
connected to God in the way that relates, and again, everybody sort of connects. We're all made in the image of God, and therefore we would potentially worship him a little bit differently too, right? There
mm,
isn't one way to do that necessarily. And so I think that celebrating God's creation and celebrating the diversity in that creation, I think that would be how I would define spirituality.
Maybe if I were to define queerness and spirituality from this half hour we've been conversing so far, I think they would both be learning to live as if that idea that we're made in the image of God is not a metaphor, but is real life. It's
Yeah.
literally true, which I've talked before about, or like given workshops even about how queerness and spirituality are both kind of being more deeply connected to reality. Like,
Mhm.
so much of queerness is or detangling the lies we've told ourselves about what we're supposed to be, whether that's gay people saying we're supposed to be straight, trans people saying we're supposed to be cis, or anybody saying I'm supposed to fit into a certain model that doesn't
Right.
actually work for me. If queerness is about reminding ourselves of the reality that doesn't have to be true. Spirituality is living in the reality that God is with us at all times. We can be connected to
Right.
God because God is within us. Or maybe to say it even more succinctly, queerness and spirituality are both living in to the fact that we are the image of God, and that's not just a nice metaphor to talk about how everyone's beautiful, but literally.
You know, and even so even if it is a metaphor, it still holds true. It still
Mhm,
works, right?
mhm,
So
mhm,
metaphor or not metaphor. So whether it's metaphorical or it's actual, depending upon how you want to read that, read those passages and confront that idea, the concept still holds the same,
mhm,
because whether it's metaphorical or it's actual, respecting God's creation in its diversity and its uniqueness is spirituality and queerness at the same time, whether metaphorical or actual,
mhm,
right?
mhm.
So either way, respecting creation, respecting what God has made, and respecting each other and all of us, it's the same thing, whether it's metaphorical or actual
That's good
or
news.
literal. That's the word I'm looking for.
Yeah. Yeah. We talked recently in a theology on tap at the church about where is God, but I'm wondering if the more evocative question would have been, what does God look like? Because it brings all of this to the forefront.
Well, it makes it really personal, right? It
Mhm,
makes it really, it brings up the question in a way that people can't shy away from,
mhm,
right? Because
mhm,
looking in a mirror, or like looking at you on this camera right now, you can't not see that, right? You have to confront yourself. And when
mhm.
you say, what does God look like? What I look like is with me every day, right? And I can't get away from that. And it makes it so personal and so immediate that, yeah, you just can't ignore it. Like, so it goes from this sort of metaphysical concept to, oh, wow, if we're all made in God's image, then I actually have to respect God's creation.
Yeah. Maybe that's instead of the image of God as a metaphor, image of God as a doctrine, not this like metaphysical concept that we encounter when we open up a book, but it's
Right.
real life, which is harder to deal with. I love things that I can type and put into a file and file away,
Right.
but it's more important to live it out.
Well, and this makes it challenging because, and I was thinking about this as I was getting ready to talk with you. If I'm looking specifically at queerness, okay, it's one thing to sort of embrace the LGBTQIA community, but then it also, you then that door again swings so wide. I have to look at other religions. I have to look at other, ethnicities. I have to look at other languages and hobbies. And, it really becomes so multidimensional that I could see where a lot of people would be, it's a lot to deal with. But it could also be freeing in the same way, where there's so much more to celebrate versus saying everything should look like this and we're going to hate everything that's over here.
Mhm, mhm.
You know,
Which may be more
it just,
comfortable at the get go, but is not more alive. And I don't think that comfort is actually as comfortable as people think it is.
yeah. And it definitely is not sort of the queer aspect, right? Queerness and is, I see so much more joy and acceptance versus that sort of denial.
Hmm. Hmm. It's much more yes and instead of either or us versus them. So I'm
Exactly.
looking at the other couple of questions that I've been asking all of our guests for this Illuminate podcast. And I mean, I think you may have already answered them, but the other two questions are, what do you think other people of faith can learn from this conversation of queerness? Or what have you learned about God from being specifically an ally, but learning to like embrace queerness for your own life and what it looks like too, which are kind of two sides of the same question. Maybe they're separate. But is
Yeah.
there a lesson that you've learned that you wish other people of faith, maybe particularly Christians, since we're coming from a Christian context, but even it doesn't have to be Bible believing Christian or any narrow
Sure.
um, boundaried community, but is there any lesson that you've learned that you really wish the world or those listening could learn?
Well, I'm going to start from somewhat of a simple place,
Mhm.
because if you make it too big, it can be too hard for people who are getting started to really wrap their head around. When I moved into more of an active allyship role and interest, I did a lot of research out there to say, what kind of resources are there to support people like me who want to support, who need to learn. I don't need my child to educate me. I need to do that work. I sort of saw that there were two major camps out there of people talking. There's the people who are staunchly against boo, sorry, that's my personal. And then there are those people that are so staunchly for that they're going to whack you over the head with glitter rainbows and get on board or get out of the way, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if there was something that I wish people could take away from is where that barbell does exist, but there's a whole lot of room in the middle,
Mm-hmm.
where I would say there are those of us out there that the door is cracked, the door is open. They're like, I want to learn more. Maybe I'm nervous. Maybe I'm not sure if my church is okay with it. Maybe, I've heard a lot of people say God isn't okay with it, but I really want to learn. I would say, open that door, be
Mm-hmm.
curious, open that door, be curious, start to learn, because there's so much beauty behind it and so much I've learned about myself in this process, because it's been so spiritual for me, because I've really had to confront what I was taught when I was younger to where I am now. When you open that door and you just say, I'm going to trust in God and I'm going to trust and learn about this, it's really powerful. Because coming back to the point of, I think a lot of people are very scared to open that door because they somehow think that they're going to move into that scarcity position, right? There's less for them. They become less important. They have less. And it's really exactly the opposite. The more that we support one another and the more kindness we have, the more love we have, the more, rising tides raise all ships, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so coming back to, if I could say one thing, is just keep it simple. Open the door. Just be curious. Just open that door a little bit and look and learn. You don't have to run to either side. Just open that door.
Amen. I mean, what a good word. I was thinking too, to follow up that question with the, what would you offer parents of people who are trying to figure this out? And that feels like the perfect word for that too. But I mean, that would have been such a good word for myself at 18, 19, 20, when I was a person like, I've been told this, I'm starting to think things. But I remember the first step for me, you said trust and learn. And I was like, I am going to trust in myself and trust in this God that I've been spending so much of my life thinking about, learning to love, that I can at least learn a little bit more about this.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
I prayed something like, God, I trust you enough to take this next step and for you to show me if I'm wrong. And it was that
Yeah.
slowly led to where I am now. And
And in
it's
so many, especially from a parental perspective, many times you feel like you have to have all the answers right away. Like you have to know, like I have to protect my child and I've got to know everything. And that's a daunting, we don't know everything. And I think that you put artificial pressure on yourself when you feel like you are supposed to make those judgments or have those pronouncements, or, at the end of the day, when Emerson and we started having all these conversations, I would just look at my kid and say, this is an aspect of you. You are still my child. You are my child, and I am lucky to know you. And so this is an aspect that I just need to learn. I need to trust, and I don't need all the answers right away. And guess what? My kid doesn't have all the answers right away. And that's fine. No one does. Life is a journey, and we have to remember, there's another podcaster that I listen to pretty regularly. I'll borrow his expression. All we have to do is figure out the next right thing. It's like, what is the next right step? What is the next right answer? Like, where are we going? And trust in that journey. And it's a beautiful one.
Mm-hmm.
It's not easy, but it's beautiful.
The painting right here that I don't think you can read because of the blur, it says, I will seek you in the morning, which I think comes from a psalm. Oh my God, I'm a bad biblical scholar because I can't remember the quote of it. But
it's all right.
More than the Bible verse that it may or may not reference. Someone prove me watching this later. It's reminiscent. A friend painted that for me. Oh my gosh, like even before I started to come out. So I've been carrying that a long time. But there was a song that we grew up singing. I wonder if we've sung it in Christ Church or if you're familiar with it, but it's step by step. It says, I will seek you in the morning and I will learn to follow your ways, and step by step you'll lead me. But I remember at a young age, that like step-by-step idea became so important to me, and I think took me where I am now in so many ways. But it's step by step. Life is way bigger than the limits we put around it. Life does not come with a map that shows, well, this is how you get to the end. Instead, there's something queer and spiritual, I think, about trusting the steps to unfold one step at a time.
Yeah. And having the strength to continue forward, because it's not like I said, it's not easy for any of us, right? On any front, but it's having that trust and continuing forward and building those connections and building that community that supports you on the way, because nothing is worse than feeling like you're walking alone in the dark. There's a tyranny in silence. There's a tyranny in loneliness, where we find ourselves doing things that aren't natural to who we are. And so trusting, building that community, making those connections, finding an environment like Christ Church, where this is, these types of conversations can naturally happen and we can learn together. It's very powerful.
Mm-hmm. And it is, I'll end on this note. It makes me so thankful for who we are at Christ Church too. I was sharing with someone this weekend about what I do. They're like, I didn't know that was a job. And I said, I didn't either until I found it. Well, this found me. But I remember one of the questions I was asking, and people were like, what is your job going to entail? When I took this job before we actually moved to New York. And I wondered if it would be like akin to my work as a youth minister, except for instead of a youth group, I had an LGBTQ group that was kind of its own little bubble within the church, but maybe had some connections because of family members. And a lot of youth ministry really, unfortunately, functions that way. It's like a little microcosm separate from the rest of the church. But that is not who we are at the LGBTQ ministry at all. And I love it. We have plenty of get-togethers that are exclusively queer people, but we never really build those boundaries intentionally. And we do things like, you helped so much with the Pride Parade this year, and that was so meaningful to me as in my role and in my position as a queer person with parents who's healed when I see other parents be incredible allies. And yeah, just who like there are no clear boundaries. We don't have like a little gay corner of the church that is the only place that gay people feel comfortable,
Right.
queer people feel comfortable going to, nor do we have like a gay church exclusively. It's not a church that's entirely LGBTQ, but it's way more integrated, and I think a beautiful picture of the kingdom of God. So
Yeah,
thankful
absolutely.
for your little pixel in that unboundaried picture that we have.
Great way to put it. Great way to put it. I'm happy to be part of that pixel in the bigger picture of Christ Church and of the bigger picture beyond that too.
Oh, I wish I knew more about computer generated image, the ever rendering image of God. I'm sure there's some techie metaphor there that would be potent, but that was my best shot. Was there anything else, reminder spirit, that you'd like to share before we wrap up, Deborah?
No, just I mean, if I could say anything, for those parents who are, find themselves, not understanding the journey of their child, I'll say hang in there. Look for the beauty. It's in there. Yeah, I'll just stop there and say, just keep looking for the beauty even when it's hard, because it's there and it's amazing.
Hallelujah. What a good compass, not right or wrong, but beauty in life.
Yeah.
Well, I love it. Thank you, Debra, so much for this, for your wisdom, for who you are, for what you are to this church and what you're bringing to this podcast. And friends who are watching, you can always learn more, find other episodes of Illuminate and learn more about what we do in the LGBTQIA+ ministry, which again is not just for LGBTQ folk, but for allies and all of us who are unfolding this queer and spiritual life that we are living. And we can find out more by going to christchurchnyc.online/pride. Again, that's christchurchnyc.online/pride. Or reaching out to me. My email is probably somewhere in the information around which you're finding this podcast. So I'm always contact away. But again, thank you, Deborah. Thank you all for joining. We'll see you next time. Bye, y'all.
Thank you, Tyler.